We've been talking about things that we've lost, things that we lose as we walk away from the Father, things that the prodigal loses when he walks away from his Father. And home is one of the more obvious ones. We talk about truth, we've talked about order, we've talked about work. When we say that the prodigal lost his home when he walked away, it's almost too obvious. And isn't that kind of the point? Doesn't he kind of want to lose his home? The prodigal abandons home in search of freedom. And I think honestly for us in Western culture and specifically in American culture, this part of the story doesn't shock us all that much. I mean, we might look at the prodigal story and think, yeah, it'd be better if he was less reckless, it'd be better if he was more moral. But we really think nothing of the prodigal leaving home. But one of the things we have to remember is that Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he's making a point here. The Pharisees have been looking at the people in their culture that they consider to be the worst sinners, people who have essentially not only abandoned faith, but have abandoned their own people in the process of abandoning that faith. And so when Jesus is speaking about this young man who leaves his home, and to emphasize the point, says he goes to a distant country, we need to understand that even before Jesus starts to describe him as going out and living a wild life, the leaving itself would be repulsive to his audience. They would be disgusted with this young man for abandoning father, abandoning family, abandoning his tribe, his nation, his people. This is all considered unthinkable. And in Scripture, the prodigal story, the parable of the prodigal, is first and foremost a story about forgiveness, right? See, the father's ability to forgive all that has transpired. But secondarily, it is a cautionary tale. Now, that's important because in Western culture has treated the prodigal kind of as a prescription. Because we not only have bought into the assumption that sending our children out into the world is sort of a rite of passage, but along with that assumption, we're assuming that in the process they will shed most or all of their accountability to family and to fellowship. Now, we hope that they won't be as reckless as the prodigal was, but there's no guarantees, and we kind of tell ourselves we have no recourse. We say really stupid things in American culture, like, well, they're 18, I guess they're adults now, there's nothing I can do about it. As if a parent-child relationship is not a sacred covenant designed by God, but is just something handed down to us by the state, and it expires. I've even known many Christian families to observe their children graduating from the faith by the time they graduate from high school, and then console themselves with this assumption that this rebellion is normal and natural and that they'll return. They'll return when they get married, or they'll return when they start having children of their own. And maybe they will. Maybe like the prodigal in the story, this is not an ideal pathway, but maybe they'll recognize that the path they're following doesn't yield the results that they thought it would. That works sometimes because the recklessness of prodigals is balanced against the stability of the home. So the prodigal, when he's deceived by this worldliness, and goes out and tries to experience what he thinks is going to be his fulfillment, crashes and burns, and then his eyes are opened then to the wisdom and the virtue of his home. Now, when prodigals abandon virtue and accountability and honor, society as a whole generally does not crumble. Why not? Because there are still families and there are still fellowships that are pursuing virtue and accountability and honor. But what happens if everyone decides to play the prodigal? What happens if everyone engages selfish ambition as the standard for how we make our way through life? And I'm not asking this morning as a rhetorical question, because in all honesty, this is what our culture has been flirting with. How will we, as homes and churches, trying to live in Christ, how will we respond to a prodigal world where everyone is guided more by selfish ambition than anything else? And in order to answer that, as we make our way back to the Father, as we return to the embrace of the Father, I think we really have to recapture a sense of what home is really all about. And home is more than a house. More than a house. It's not just a place that we live. It's not just the people that we live with. It's a more expansive concept than that. It's a question about where we belong. What is the habitat of the human soul? Where has God designed us to be? And what does it mean for us to come home? I want to suggest this morning that home is concentric fellowships centered around God. It is marriages, it is families, it is extended family, it is friend groups, it is neighborhoods, it's churches, it's communities, it's even states and nations. They are all fellowships where God is at the center, at least for our part. That's a lot of potential relationships. But that business of God being at the center is the important bit, because God, who himself exists in community. He exists in three persons, and those three persons are somehow one. That's difficult for us to comprehend. But God exists in community. He is individual in expression, and he is one in nature. God is at the center of all human community, all human fellowship, all human family, all human home. That oneness of the Godhead is the model for how human relationships are actually supposed to work. And the more important the relationship is, the more critical it is that it reflect that unity of godly oneness. And this is where we start to get uncomfortable in Western cultures, where we start to get uncomfortable in American culture. Because we associate all that connectivity with burden. See, Western culture is deeply invested in something called individualism. And individualism is really kind of an essential American ethic. And in fact, it is rooted in a biblical ethic. It's this idea that there is intrinsic value in each one of you as individuals. And where does that value come from? It comes from the fact that you are created in the image of God. So before you do anything, before you say anything, before you try to create value in any other way, you have value as a person, value as an individual, because you're created in God's image, and we hold you up and esteem you that way. Because we assume that the individual has values in Western culture and specifically in American culture, we assume the rights of the individual. We prioritize the rights of the individual. That's great politically. It's fantastic politically, because essentially what it means is that human government is not supposed to be able to impose upon my rights and my independence and my freedom unless they can demonstrate an absolute need to impose themselves. Now, we all know that the government doesn't necessarily use the same standards that we do in arriving at its conclusions about what it needs to do, but because of this focus on individualism, we at least have a sense of political freedom and individual identity in this country that's not supposed to be infringed upon. But individualism as a whole has worked out in our culture primarily because it's balanced by a sense of what is in the common good. So if everybody just simply thought about themselves as individuals and nobody thought about the common good, individualism would be kind of a disaster, right? But it's because of this sense of the common good that it has worked out. It's been held in check. It's been balanced. What happens when the interests of individuals are prioritized over everything else? What happens when that becomes the apex of our civilization? What happens to marriages when we're more interested in individualism than oneness? What happens to our families? What happens to our churches if the individual is the absolute priority? What happens to community? What happens to truth and order? Don't we, in fact, end up prioritizing ourselves right over God? I want to share with you something this morning that might be a little bit jarring. It might even be a little bit un-American. Individualism is not that good for us. It's really not that good for us. I think what we've done to some extent in American culture is we've normalized the prodigal. We've even celebrated the prodigal because we have started treating the self rather than God as the linchpin of human culture and human community. So today's individualism is really just a sanitized version of selfish ambition. That same selfish ambition that robs us of our true work, that undermines the order of God, that rewrites the truth of God. And it does all that by placing self above all of those things. Self is more important than the truth. Self is more important than the order. Self is more important than our work. Effectively, self is more important than God. And so when we try to have a conversation about what is in the common good, when we try to talk about accountability, or we talk even about basic morality, we tend to view these things as some kind of a limitation on myself. You're infringing upon the liberty of me. So it makes it really difficult for us to approach concepts like oneness. It makes it really difficult for us to talk about unity in the church. It makes it almost impossible for us to talk about how to build healthy families and healthy marriages, because all of these things are a threat to my independent, individual self. And it's such a core assumption in our world, in our culture, that it feels very normal to us. And even right now, some of you hearing me talk about these things, hearing me say these things, there's a part of you that's going, how do I listen this morning and still protect my individuality from what he's going to say next? Because we're programmed this way. We've bought into it. Selfish ambition replaces godly fellowship with the individual. Godly fellowship, those sort of unified relationships and unified communities that are modeled after God himself and that are accountable to God, those relationships are the home, the habitat of the soul. They're what we need to make life livable. They're what we need to thrive. And they're meant to be the building block of human culture and human society. And what selfish ambition does is it comes along and flips all of that on its head and attempts to make me the foundation of everything. I'll just focus on myself, and everything else will flow from there. And in this view, home gets redefined because home exists primarily to support the selfish ambition of the individual. And so marriage is less about oneness than it's about two individuals who, by agreement, by contract, are validating each other's individuality. And words like submission and sacrifice, be they mutual or otherwise, are just dirty words. We don't want to talk about that. Family is less about oneness than parents laboring endlessly to provide their children a springboard for their selfish pursuits. And honestly, these days, what we're seeing more and more is parents are too busy with their own selfish ambition to question whether or not this is even wise. And the church itself is less about fellowship than it's about self-help and self-improvement and self-realization. Folks, the negative impact of individualism is readily observed. All of this navel-gazing and focusing on what we need and focusing on our rights and focusing on our ambitions has naturally yielded a world in which we're all individually more happy, right? No. It's done just the opposite. In a culture that's pursuing personal happiness as the ultimate goal, we are decidedly less happy as a culture. In a culture that's always preaching to us about acceptance and tolerance, we are decidedly less kind as a culture. And we have so glamorized the liberty of the prodigal that young adults feel compelled to prolong childhood as long as they possibly can. Because we view responsibility, even those responsibilities that help us to build fellowship, we view responsibility as a burden rather than a virtue. And everyone's so busy fighting for their rights that nobody has noticed that the spaces that we're living in are more damaged, the relationships in which we exist are less reliable, our accomplishments are less satisfying, and overall the world is more selfish and meaner. And I say we haven't noticed because our present solution to individualism is more radical individuality. That's a good solution. It hasn't been working all that well, so let's pile it higher and deeper. The culture at present is really sort of shifting towards this assumption that the needs and the dreams and the aspirations and even the chosen identity of the individual are so paramount that the community, the whole world, everybody needs to just adapt to me. I don't need to be a part of the community. The community needs to figure out how to be a part of me. And even if we don't buy into the overt selfishness of that, it's hard to deny that we have taken a lot of this selfish ambition to heart. We really like thinking, in one way or another, that it is acceptable and that it is moral and that it is even noble for us to put ourselves first. And then Matthew 16:24, Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Oh, Jesus, you are messing things up again. The world, the nation, our community, our church, our homes, and every one of us needs a radical solution. But the radical solution is not more individuality. The radical solution here is self-denial. That's what Jesus proposes. Deny yourself. That's the beginning of the journey. And for some reason, this still surprises us. This is still shocking to us. We're still rationalizing why this can't be the case. But it really should come as no surprise. In God's view, Going back to the very beginning, unanswered individuality is the lone defect in the creation. He created us in His image. Now remember, His image is an image of three individuals who exist in perfect community. They are completely one. And God creates us then as individuals who have unique gifts and unique individual traits and have an individual power of choice. But He creates us to be fulfilled in family and in fellowship. So when God looks at creation, He says, man, that's good. And when He looks at the man and the woman, He says, this is very good. But when He looks at the man by himself, He says, this is not good. It is not good for mankind to be alone. Alone is how we're made. It's not what we're made for. We are made for the connection of fellowship. We are made to be united with others. We long for it. We are hungry for it, but we constantly resist it. Maybe out of fear, maybe because we're trying to protect ourselves, but we are holding, often at arm's length, the very thing that we desperately need to make life livable. Healthy, godly fellowship. In marriage, in family, in our church, in our communities. This is what James says. James chapter 3, verse 13 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom." Today we might call that adulting. It is this business of assuming relationships and assuming responsibilities that are going to help us build healthy lives and build healthy fellowships. And in every healthy fellowship is embedded opportunity and obligation. Opportunity we like. Yay, opportunity. Obligation, not so much. We have a tendency to think that obligation is a burden. Obligation shouldn't always be defined that way. Jesus says in Matthew 11, He says, "Take my yoke upon you because it's easy and my burden is light." It's not because the yoke of Christ is without obligation. It's because the obligation is part of the work and part of the order, part of the oneness for which you were created. So being yoked in this way, taking on this obligation, taking on this burden, is light because it's going to deliver to you exactly what you need in order to be alive. Obligation to the Lord, obligation to our spouse, obligation in family, obligation to fellowship should be sweet. It should be a light burden because it brings with it a lot of life-giving opportunity. James goes on in verse 14, he says, "If you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." See, the prodigal temptation is to abandon the opportunity of fellowship in order to be free of the obligation. And what most people are doing as they make their way through life is they're trying to exploit the opportunities of human connection without agreeing to any of the obligations of human connection. And in doing so, we deny ourselves the very blessings of fellowship, the very blessings of home, or at the very least, we overinvest in protecting our individuality from the beautiful potential of oneness and community and fellowship. In our most important relationships, then, we end up feeling as though we have to fight to protect ourselves, and we have to demand our rights. And most tragically of all, we say to God, this part is mine. You can have that, but this is mine. Mine to protect. And we deprive ourselves of the most important relationship of all. We remain unsurrendered. And the freedom that we think we gain with all this is just not yielding the happiness that we seek. So James says in verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. You see, what we're missing in a culture that's built on individualism is that the measure and the fulfillment of the individual is actually their productive participation in godly fellowship. This is the wisdom of heaven. It is other-focused. It is submissive. Ooh. It is sincere. It makes peacemakers. It's a source of great love, a source of comfort, a source of joy, all the things that we are actually really seeking in life. And I know there's this doubtful voice whispering in your ear right now, because it whispers in mine too. And it says, that's all very idealistic, but the real world is not like this. The real world is selfish. And in the real world, if I'm not looking out for myself, I'm just due for damage and disappointment. And folks, I know that damage and disappointment better than I want to. It's real. But where fellowship has failed to be godly, we now have the opportunity to rebuild it in God's image. See, when we surrender ourselves to Christ, we enter into a perfect fellowship where we are precious as individuals, but we're also one with Christ, and being one with Christ, we become unified with everyone who is one with Christ. And because Jesus Christ is our source relationship, because that one relationship is so perfect, we can bear the risk of being pure and being submissive and being peace-loving in all of the other fellowships that we participate in with all the other imperfect people, with all the brokenness that it entails. We can do it because Jesus is home. And Jesus has renewed home for us. So yeah, the world is damaged. And fellowship, even this fellowship, is imperfect. But because of Jesus, we have the opportunity to build something different, something more beautiful than we have known. We have the opportunity to put ourselves at risk of not putting ourselves first. But I have to warn you something here this morning. The family-friendly ethos of the traditional American church and American home will not be enough to repair the damage that's been done. And I'll tell you why. We like to think that because we're more family-friendly than the culture, that it will affect a change. But James says this selfish ambition that the world has championed, it is, in his words, earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. In other words, it ain't a little bit bad. It's really bad. If we put all of our eggs into the basket of being a little bit better than that, we're just not saying that much. To be a little bit better than the way that the world looks at fellowship, than the way the world looks at family, than the way the world looks about how you should organize your own existence, it ain't good enough. I don't want to be a little bit better than the world. I want to be a lot more like Jesus Christ. Better isn't saying enough. Surrendered is saying enough. Devoted to fellowship, to family, to communion with Christ is saying enough. And we can take courage in the truth that there is abundant life and hope in this wisdom of heaven. See, of all the other things that we can say about selfish ambition, what we can say more than anything else about selfish ambition is, it is not working. We look at our culture, we look at our world, selfish ambition is not working. It's not delivering on the promise. And there is no sense in which adding more fuel to that fire makes it work better. We have to come to our senses. We have to come to Jesus. We have to come to fellowship. We have to come home. And when we come home, we will know the abundant life that was prepared for us.